Abebe Selassie, the head of the African Department for the International Monetary Fund, thank you so very much for your time and agreeing to speak to us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We're hearing a lot of talk that a global recession may be upon us. If that happens, will it come to Africa? How will it come to Africa? And can you give us your assessment of sort of the economic outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a question of the moment, right? The global economy has been really hammered by first the pandemic and all that it wrought, and Africa really very significantly so. And now, just as countries were beginning to recover and put a little bit the pandemic behind us, we've had this second major global and completely exogenous shock to our continent in the form of the fallout to commodity prices in particular that has happened as Russia invaded Ukraine. Both of these shocks, global in nature, really very, very large shocks in isolation, have like a multiplying effect and of course are going to be impacting the global economy and not just our countries. How it will affect our region, however, will be very varied. The continent itself, 54 countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, 45 odd countries with various economic structures. So countries that are commodity exporting, oil in particular, will have a bit more resilience to the shock. But countries that are oil importing, commodity importing, will be impacted severely. And then within countries also, there will be a very varied effect. In particular, the most vulnerable households are going to be impacted the most. Food prices have gone up very sharply. Fuel prices have gone up very sharply. Fertilizer prices have gone up. All of these, we are very worried, will be impacting the most vulnerable households in the most vulnerable countries globally quite significantly. So even if countries do not slip into a technical recession, an individual country fails, does not slip into a technical recession, you're still going to have quite a lot of dislocation, harming the most vulnerable households acutely.
We're also hearing talk of stagflation in economic circles, language which I think is from the 70s, which means stagnant growth, but still prices are rising with inflation. Not quite a recession, but not growth. Africa's economic prospects always seem so dependent on growth. How is that likely to hit the African continent? So,
we are seeing elements of both weaker economic activity and also, markedly higher prices. As I said, food prices have gone up quite sharply and are likely to remain elevated. The same thing with fuel prices, which of course have this effect of cascading throughout, other cost structures through the economy. So we are going to be seeing that tendency. Again, growth is important, of course, because, it really is a nice summary indicator of overall economic conditions in a country, prospects for creating jobs, prospects for companies, it gives you a sense of how much companies are investing, how much consumption is going up. That's why growth is important, not in and of itself, but really because what it says about standards of living and living conditions. And that is going to be dampened, as I said earlier, as a result of the headwinds facing our countries from, the really more difficult global environment. And what makes it really problematic in technical terms is that, the policy response, how policymakers react, is going to be very difficult. On the one hand, weaker economic activity suggests that you should be trying to boost your economy, allowing your fiscal deficit to widen, maybe even some monetary support. But as you said earlier, higher inflation means that your ability to stoke activity is going to be difficult because you risk exacerbating inflationary conditions. So again, I think the extent to which you're going to see conditions of weak growth and high inflation is going to vary across the region depending on current circumstances. But overall, I think it's fair to say that conditions are not going to be as good as they ought to be, as we need them to be, to facilitate a recovery from the travails of the last couple of years.
I'll come back a little later on to what African central banks can do right now, but I want to address the issue of criticism of the International Monetary Fund and ask you first how you would describe the relationship or the state of the relationship right now between the IMF and African countries. There has been long-standing criticism of the IMF's lending practices around conditionalities, fiscal austerity requirements, and of helping infrastructure investment happen in Africa, but then enforcing what some see as debilitating cuts in social spending programs when it comes time for those countries to actually repay the loans. How would you describe the state of the relationship, and what's your response to that criticism?
So I think, our role is not understood as well, and that's partly our fault because we don't do enough to explain what it is that we do, how we work with countries. So, the IMF has a threefold role in the region. So first and foremost, we, like elsewhere around the world, we provide quite a lot of policy advice on macroeconomic policy area. So we have dialogue around the world with all members of the IMF. It's called, Article 4 discussions under that article of our Articles of Agreement, which established us, and we make sure that countries are pursuing policies and have, encourage countries to pursue policies that are for the benefit of all countries around the world. So facilitating capital flows, investment flows, the kind of, and avoid policies that are destructive to the well-being of the global economy. Aggressive trade restrictions, aggressive restrictions on capital flows and the like. So we try and facilitate and make sure that the global economy works well, and by having dialogue with each individual country. And we do that, of course, with quite a large number of countries in Africa that don't borrow from us, South Africa, Nigeria, and many, many others. Second role that we have is providing quite a lot of capacity development assistance. So we do a lot of technical work with central banks, with tax authorities, with ministries of finance to promote healthy economic policies. Just to give you an example, in tax administration, what is the best way in which governments can collect taxes from large companies, from other economic activities, so that they have the resources to spend on health, education that is desperately needed in our countries. Public finance, we do a lot of work to make public finances as transparent as possible, encouraging governments to publish budgets, how to go around setting up systems that will encourage openness, transparency, minimize corruption. So we do a lot of technical work, which often does not get recognized. It's the third part of our work, which is the lending activity that we do, which tends to get a lot of public attention, media attention. And this is one where governments, in need of balance of payment support, countries that are not able to raise all of the money that they need to fund themselves from the market, as they generally would, from taxes, turn to the IMF to provide financing. The nature of this engagement tends to be episodic in countries and over time. And typically, when countries turn to the IMF for financing, they are in some difficulty, typically. And so that gives rise to, when we arrive, economic conditions are already difficult. But really important point here is that, we provide financing when everybody else is not providing financing. And we do so with a commitment from the government that policies and measures will be taken to help improve economic conditions and so that the country can recover. And it's our financing that gives countries the time and space to be able to pursue those policies. In the absence of the financing that we do, adjustment would have to be much, much more rapid. Okay, you need automatic adjustment, and you wouldn't also have the resources to smooth and do the adjustment over time. Some of this criticism, I think, is unfair.
Well, that's what I want to ask. Where do you think, and why do you think the criticism does exist, especially in a climate where African countries do now have other options, whether some of that has been pulled back or not from entities like China? Would you want African countries to continue financing with the IMF, or turn to China?
Well, first of all, I think I don't think it's like either or, not at all. We, I think, have shown how important a role we play in supporting Africa just over the last couple of years in the wake of the pandemic. I think just to take Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the part whose work I oversee, since the onset of the pandemic, we have provided about $50 billion in financing. This is at a time when, domestic market conditions were difficult, when countries were not able to tap global capital markets as much as in the years before, including, of course, recourse to lenders like China. We were the ones that stepped in and provided this amount of financing. I mean, this is historically the largest amount of financing I think the region will have received in such concentrated period from any kind of international institution. So that shows you kind of the scale of support that we provide when countries need us. What does this money do? It gives governments the ability to be able to have much more supportive policies than they otherwise would. Okay. But I think, this financing role is supplemented, as I said earlier, by a lot of the policy work that we do. And increasingly, the work that we do emphasizes inclusion. Perhaps we have not done that as much as in the past. So a lot of the emphasis of our support in recent years has been to make sure that governments introduce social protection for the most vulnerable households, for example. Governance and transparency are a key element of the work that we do, as well, of course, as the core work, which is making sure that governments continue to create an environment where macroeconomic imbalances continue to be recalibrated in the right direction, growth continues to be fostered. So that's how we support the region in times of need, and particularly given also how much development remains in our continent. Being very mindful of that and making sure that we are supportive.
I'm glad you brought up the pandemic because, of course, it saw countries around the world spend significant amounts of money in 2020, especially to combat the effects of the pandemic. And that meant that the debt levels increased worldwide. African banks, of course, owe money not only to rich countries. They of course, owe to China, to bondholders. We saw Zambia, for instance, default in 2020. In your view, are African countries right now carrying too much debt, given the situation we've come out of or are sort of coming out of, and given the situation we are currently in globally? So,
it really is important that when you're talking about debt or even economic policies, you talk about, at the country-specific level. It's really difficult to generalize in a continent as diverse as ours. So, the debt situation in aggregate, yes, has gone up. And it reflects a couple of things. I think even before the pandemic, what we had seen was countries that have been pursuing quite a lot of, investment projects, infrastructure investment, health, education, quite a lot, borrowing to invest in these areas, but not doing as well in terms of collecting tax revenues. Tax revenues are important because, that's the way you capture the rate of return on all the investment. So you build a road, you build a electric power station. It's important that you find ways in which you are able to repay the loans that you've taken towards that. And our countries, we've not done enough of a good job, in terms of mobilizing tax revenues. So reflecting that, debt levels had gone up in many countries. And then you have, of course, the effects of the pandemic, which was really, really economically really very, significant in our countries. And what that did, of course, was it dampened economic activity, it hit tax revenues, and required governments to spend more. So debt levels went up another notch in the vast majority of countries. As a result of this, some countries have gone into a default situation, or the risk of debt vulnerability has gone up in a lot of countries. And as you said, countries like Zambia, Chad is another one, have had to turn to their creditors and seek debt restructuring. and because African countries, because we have limited alternative access to capital markets, domestic markets are weaker. This type of resilience mechanisms that many other countries have in the advanced world and large emerging markets. The debt situation is more acute in our countries than it is elsewhere. But again, even within this context, it really is important that the situation of debt, whether debt is sustainable or not, is a fairly dynamic one, a country-specific one, and one that depends on the economic outlook. Just to give you a small example, a couple of years ago, Angola was under quite a bit of pressure. We had an economic program supporting them. And one of the important reasons Angola was under debt pressure was, of course, oil prices being as low as they were. The government, pursued quite a lot of, reforms, making sure that they could strengthen their economy. And now with the recovery in oil prices, the debt situation in Angola has changed quite a bit. So, 2-3 years ago, I would have said Angola is one of the countries that I'm most worried about. Now the outlook has changed. So that's in general, that's why I think it's really important. While in aggregate, debt levels are high, and there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done in our countries to reduce macroeconomic balances, address debt vulnerabilities, and in some cases restructure debt. But it's a fluid and dynamic situation, and one that you have to look at in a country-specific basis.
Do you think that more waves of loan forgiveness, or as you said, restructuring or rescheduling, are going to be necessary from international financial institutions for Africa going forward?
So much is going to depend on what the economic outlook going forward is likely to be. It remains the case that a lot of the financing that's provided by multilateral development banks remains some of the most concessional financing that you can find anywhere. It's much more long term also, and these entities continue to lend to countries, so they're providing new financing. The financing gaps that countries face, the challenge that they face, really arise more from debt that is much more expensive, commercial type debt, borrowed either in capital markets via Eurobonds or syndicated loans, etc. Those tend to carry higher interest rates, and some other bilateral debt that they have, which also have higher interest rates. But for each country, the kind of reprofiling that's going to be needed will depend on what the source of pressure that countries face are, and that's how you want to address these kind of any needs that arise for debt to be rescheduled.
And of course, giving advice is part of what you do. What, in your view, are 2 or 3 of the most important things that you would say African central banks need to do right now?
So central banks are in a difficult position, as we were discussing earlier. They're facing basically, in many cases, economic conditions that remain weak. Either because recovery post-pandemic has not been as strong as you want to see, or because you're facing global, the shock from all of the turmoil we're seeing in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So they have to balance that with rising inflation in many cases. So striking a balance between, making sure that you don't reduce recovery and avoid stoking inflation is a very difficult place to be for central bankers. In the conversations and the discussions that we have, and generally it's just an exchange because a lot of the calibration is country specific. What we try and emphasize really is just what the optimal way of striking this balance is. In some countries, where, for example, the countries where exchange rates are fixed, you don't have the exchange rate also as a way to help allow adjustment. So in that case, you probably have to lean a little bit more towards monetary policy tightening and allowing interest rates to go up a bit. In other cases, it may be that you allow the exchange rate to go through. In yet other cases, you not see inflation looks to be more transitory. So in those cases, you want to be very watchful and not necessarily necessarily take action immediately. So really depends on very country-specific circumstances. But in each case, I think the overarching emphasis is about striking a balance to make sure that you don't hold back growth or kindle too much inflationary pressure.
Are there any conditions that you would say African leaders or African policymakers or countries should be prepared to accept in coming years if international institutions do reschedule or restructure their loans, such as political or economic reforms, any kind of progressive social inclusion or other human rights improvements that could be viewed as ultimately having good outcomes for African countries?
You know, I don't think the reason for countries to pursue their economic policies ought to be for outside audience, right? It's really much more important for for our people. So I think what I see again, as I mentioned earlier, one area of weakness that I see in overall, in a larger number of countries, is this inability to collect more domestic tax revenues. I think that remains really a very important challenge. Our countries are increasingly much more boisterous democracies. And I don't think we've started having the conversation about, how it is that, governments can collect taxes more and avoid relying on borrowing to do all of the investment, all of the development needs that our countries have in health, in education, in infrastructure. I think that piece of the social contract, I don't think has perhaps been paid enough attention in our countries. So we tend to rely on a lot more commodity revenues, but that tends to be fickle. The formal sector tends to be a bit smaller than in other countries. So what kind of policies do we need to pursue to make sure that the larger informal sector becomes much more into the mainstream, contributes more to taxes? But these are very deeply domestic and deeply political discussions. It will depend on in each country in terms of what kind of social contract is needed. So I think strengthening that side of our country's development is going to be, I think, very important in the future to address the development challenges that we face.
Do you foresee that becoming a condition?
In discussions with us?
Yes.
No. I mean, first, I think, the policy choices that countries make in order to address, macroeconomic imbalances that they face, we think, are going to be, of course, in the realm of, parliament, domestic political discussions. Our discussions tend to focus a lot more on, what kind of macroeconomic policies make sense in aggregate. And then how, what kind of tax structure you want to have, what kind of spending composition structure you want to have. Of course, are going to be, as I said earlier, deeply domestic and deeply political discussions. Now, we will, of course, emphasize the need for social protection, particularly in times of economic difficulties that countries are in. We would like to see a lot more emphasis on social protection. But frankly, I mean, governments these days, of course, also do that. So it's not that they need us to come and tell them that. So it's generally not a discussion that's a difficult one. But, as to exactly how countries ought to be paying for this, whether it's a tax in one area versus another, spending prioritization in one area versus another, I think these are really important conversations that have to be internal rather than being made at our behest.
You mentioned earlier inclusion and an area where you think the International Monetary Fund could have done a better job in the past. I think every government is thinking the same thing where that is concerned. What is the IMF prepared to do to help buffer or mitigate the impact of the global economic crisis on the most vulnerable communities in African countries? Women, smallholder subsistence farmers, informal traders, but particularly women?
Very good question. First, I think in aggregate, as I said earlier, we have done really, I mean, we as our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva says, we had once in a 100-year shock, an unprecedented shock. And our response really has been unprecedented also as an institution this last couple of years in the wake of the pandemic. I mentioned earlier how much support we've provided financially, but also in terms of policy advice, in terms of capacity development, we really, really have just stepped up like never before, I think, in our history. Second, within that, and over the last several years, really very important reforms that we've been doing internally have been to emphasize both longer-term structural challenges, but also existing ones that we perhaps have not paid enough attention to. An example of the longer-term structural challenge, particularly in a forward-looking way, is climate change. So we're doing quite a lot of work right now to help countries calibrate policies and to address the climate change. In some countries it's in the mitigation area, in other countries adaptation. So we're doing a lot of work in that, and we've just been provided more resources by our board after quite a bit of a push to be able to expand our work in that area. Gender type issues is also a very, very important area that we're doing work on. This emphasis in inclusion comes from, I think, increased recognition by our institution that, in the past we expected, whether it's, this inequality in the gender dimension or particularly in the income dimension, we expected, macroeconomic policies at the aggregate level would eventually trickle down and help foster inclusion. But that has not been the case in the income sense, and also gender, of course, remains, the gender dimension of inclusion remains problematic in many, many countries. So we have a lot more emphasis. So we're doing quite, a lot of work advising countries individually on, what kind of policies are needed to facilitate gender inclusion. In some cases, it is removing policy-induced barriers, actual laws that have restrictions in women participating fully. In other cases, you don't have formal laws that restrict that, but you have ways in which, either directly or more subtly, the way the budget is formulated, for example, has a bearing on adverse gender outcomes. So being mindful of that, wherever that's, exacerbating, where policies tend to exacerbate gender inequality. So I would say kind of, we're doing a lot more to be sensitive to these kind of issues and include them in the mainstream work that we do